Hi, everyone. This is Jason Barrack of Wall Street for Main Street. Welcome back to another Wall Street for Main Street podcast interview. Today's first special guest is a first-time guest. I'm very excited to have him on. I've been following his work on LewRockwell.com for many years. It's one of my favorite websites. I always try to catch the Lew Rockwell podcast with the truth and talking about government intervention and Austrian School Economics. He also was the former chief of staff of Ron Paul, and he was one of the founders of the Ludwig von Mises Institute, which was one of my favorite websites as well. It's a website that has really woken me up. Their YouTube channel is one of the best channels out there on YouTube. You can learn Austrian School Economics with their lectures and their books and free articles. It's really probably the best resource out there on the internet in terms of actually giving yourself a financial and economic education, and Lew Rockwell is a big part of that. He's here to talk about his new book today, also Against the State and Anarcho-Capitalist Manifesto. So thank you for joining us, Lew Rockwell.
Jason, great to be with you.
Now, Lew, we just have so much going on in the world in terms of economic intervention, geopolitical intervention. What's your opinion of the Keynesians and the Neo Cons and the progressives? It just seems, they hate libertarians, and, they're blaming a lot of this stuff on capitalism and the free markets.
Well, of course, these types, these people who believe in effect, government running all of society, not just the economy, but being in charge of everything in your life, your home, your neighborhood, your family, your marriage, your any religious institutions, charitable institutions that you're affiliated with, your business, of course. They would just like to run everything. So, of course, these guys are hostile to libertarianism, since libertarianism is the philosophy of freedom. I mean, it's the idea that we don't need a ruling class, that human beings can just be left alone, we don't need a government, that this is the way to greater civilization, heights of civilization, to far more prosperity, far more human flourishing. Government is always, think of government, it's like a knife. So if some guy who's in great shape would be representing the economy, it's like the government's stabbing him in the back with a knife. It's not good for you, not good for any of us. And I think, especially since 9/11, although I'd argue maybe even since Lincoln, since FDR and LBJ and many other bad guys in American history, that we've seen the state just growing, metastasizing like a cancer. And, they'd like to take away all our civil liberties. I noticed something that Obama just signed where if you are said to have the symptoms of Ebola, that he can put you in a camp. He can involuntarily put you into some kind of a facility, I'm sure, to die. So we have a government today that sees nothing can inhibit it. It can do anything it wants. There's nothing the government might do that they might say, well, wait a minute, maybe we shouldn't do that because it's wrong. That never occurs. Maybe that never occurred to government, but certainly these days they're very open about their nature and that they believe they should run us all, happy to shoot us, taser us, and off expeditionary forces and airplanes and so forth to bomb people in other countries, murder people. Because, of course, in every war, the vast number of casualties are civilians. They're not soldiers. And so President Obama, I know, signs the orders every day for drone strikes. Many, many civilians are killed by these things. I guess he signs it over his scrambled eggs or whatever and has a good time doing it. And as Hayek pointed out in The Road to Serfdom, the worst rise to the top in government. In private affairs, there's no utopia, of course. Nothing is ever perfect. But by and large, the most capable people, the smartest people, the hardest working, most creative people are the ones who rise to the top of private enterprises. Government, it's the most criminal, the biggest liars, the most effective manipulators who rise to the top. And so, it seems to be a good idea, because I would argue that we don't need a state whatsoever. We don't need a bunch of people who are able to decide on their own how much of your money they're going to take every year. Maybe they take 40%, maybe they take 45%, or whatever it is. They get to decide, and you get to have nothing to say about it. So I don't think that that sort of conduct, that sort of institution is necessary. In fact, I think it's a great evil. Everything that government does is a threat. I mean, you just look at, if you sufficiently resist paying your library fine, they claim the right to kill you. But what?
Or parking tickets, yeah.
Yeah, well, what is that? I mean, so it's a bunch of little Attila the Huns, and the government is
making $100,000 a year now too.
Well, and of course retiring all those millionaires. I mean, there was a great story in one of the California papers recently about school teachers, public school teachers, firemen, and cops all retiring as millionaires. I mean, not only do they make very high salaries while they're quote unquote working, but they retire with such vast pensions they're all rich, unlike the poor people who are taxed to support them.
Yeah, exactly. And some of them get hired back as consultants, so they're making 2 or 3 different salaries at 6 figures. Obviously, not every one of them is making that, but this is a problem, with government allocating capital. It's misallocating capital. There's a whole bunch of people who have figured out how to game the system and things like that. I think one thing I've learned from your work, Lew, and I followed your work for a long time, like I said, besides, learning the Austrian School Economics and other books I've read, it's chased me down the rabbit hole with John Perkins' Confessions of an Economic Hitman, who's not a libertarian, but he is a whistleblower.
Great book.
Yeah. Yeah, he's not a libertarian. His solution for government problems is just to clean up government and basically end capitalism. But anyway, though, one thing I've learned from your work, Lew, is that government basically and I'm also a history major, is that government lies all the time and only tells the truth when it's convenient. And I think that's something that a lot of foreigners really understand because, foreigners have tend to have not good experiences with government, especially, in countries where they've had really bad inflation, in Argentina or China or Brazil or things like that, where the politicians are extremely corrupt and have stolen money or have hyperinflated a currency. But Americans seem to have, this fairy tale view of government where, we have our own vote, we can vote the bad guys out, where our vote actually means something. I think most Americans, unfortunately, I don't know if you agree with this, Lew, most Americans, besides you and me and a small percentage of libertarians, seem to still be kind of brainwashed, or they don't care because, they're watching reality TV or sports or things like that.
Well, I think, everything you say is true, and people are indeed brainwashed, and it's the myth of democracy. It's the idea that we, the people, are the government, and we can easily change it. They don't take into account the fact that it's always creep A versus creep B, and the state itself never loses. The state's got 2 candidates. We get to choose A versus B, but it has no effect on what's happening. So, but people are fooled, and they think that America's different. They think we're the richest, the best, the most powerful, the greatest, all the rest of the stuff with the foam finger of the number 1. And of course it's not true. I mean, there are many other countries that are more prosperous, other countries that are freer, and do Americans know that? I don't know. So they just watch the the military jets flying over the NFL game or whatever, and the troops sitting in the seats and being glorified. And there's something wrong with that. We're all supposed to put the most wonderful people in society are the killers. Well, I think that there's obviously a role for defense, policing, and that sort of thing in a private economy. But you'd want private companies doing it. You don't want something like the Pentagon. You don't want something like your local police department, all of which are going to, metastasize, spying on us, tasering us at will, doing, and if you even graze their arm when they're talking to you by mistake,
it's a felony assault.
It's a huge felony. You can go to jail for years, and they're a separate caste. They're above us. We're just what Will Creek calls the mundane. But if they accidentally kill a family, exactly, and if they accidentally kill, a family member or your dog or something like that, you may get an apology, but it's a pain in the butt. You're not going to get any type of tremendous apology or money in a lawsuit or anything like that. You're not going to really get any kind of public admission that we royally screwed this up, because that's just not how the government works. Well, the first rule of policing is the so-called officer safety, and if the cop thinks that he might potentially be in danger from your chained-up little dog, and he shoots the dog, or he shoots your uncle or whatever, and he can claim that he was he was afraid. That's it. You can't. All the courts rule that indeed he did the right thing, and you really are a creep for being concerned that he shot your uncle to death in your backyard at a party. I mean, there were people making that up. That's an actual thing that happened. So
yeah, it's the government courts. Yeah, they set the rules, and they tend to almost always rule in the government's favor, right? I mean, I guess Irwin. I follow Irwin Schiff's case. I mean, he had a pretty good case against the government, and he found out the hard way in the government's courts that they weren't going to rule in his favor.
Well, the government, of course, is always the judge in its own case. I mean, that alone shows that it's an illegitimate operation. So yeah, so Irwin Schiff was put in jail. He's a very elderly man. He's a sick man. He's chained to a hospital bed in this gigantic, horrible prison in Angola, Indiana. So what did he do for years? What did he do? He answered questions at a meeting when he was talking about his newest book that the judge said he shouldn't have answered. He shouldn't have discussed certain things, and he put him into federal prison for a speech crime. He's a political prisoner. He's a political prisoner just as clearly as anybody in North Korea. So where also you can get put into prison for saying the wrong thing about something the government believes in.
Exactly, Lew. It's like Animal Farm, where you don't want the certain animals riling up the other animals, right? When Irwin Schiff is telling other people how to get around not paying their taxes or things like that. So it doesn't surprise me that the government did what it did. But Irwin should have known that the government was going to do this. But he's a very courageous man.
Well, also I only heard him speak once in person. But he is unbelievably eloquent. I could see now where Peter gets his eloquence. I mean, Irwin Schiff can give a great off-the-cuff speech. There's not an there's not an ah. Every sentence follows, every paragraph follows. He's just a brilliant orator. And so, I can see why they wanted to shut him up. That doesn't mean, of course, they were right to shut him up, because they're actually the evildoers and he's the good guy. But this is America, the prison capital of the world. Far more people proportionately in prison here than any other country in the world, including, by the way, North Korea, China, Russia, all these the boogeymen. The U.S. is the one that has the most people in a cage. Something wrong with putting human beings in a cage. It's not. I think it's entirely unjust. Also, let's say it's an actual criminal, unlike poor Irwin Schiff. Let's say it's an actual rapist or murderer or robber. So the victims have to also pay for this guy's incarceration, whereas clearly the only just system would be to make the guy work to pay the victims, some kind of compensation for the victims. And there are private companies that could handle this. But of course, if there's ever a fine for any wrongdoing, it doesn't go to the people who were wronged, it goes to the government. So the whole criminal justice system, crooked prosecutors, crooked judges, it's corrupt and a source of injustice virtually always from top to bottom, from the highest courts to the lowest courts. And that, of course, is just part of the problem in this very, very statist, I would actually argue fascist society that we now live in.
Yeah, I completely agree. The court system it's designed by the lawyers for the lawyers. The corporations know all the loopholes. They hire lobbyists or lawyers and tax accountants to redesign all the laws that benefit them, that make it harder for the entrepreneur and the small businessman to compete with them. And that's the exact definition of fascism. I want to move on to our next topic here, Lew. We were talking before the show about anarcho-capitalism and Murray Rothbard. I just finished What Has Government Done to Our Money? And Murray Rothbard was one of the first persons who coined the term anarcho-capitalism. So what does that mean to you? And what do you think of Murray Rothbard's What Has Government Done to Our Money? Do you think it's still prescient now?
Oh, yeah. And, of course, first of all, if people listening to the show, if you've not read Rothbard, it's such a pleasure to read him. I mean, once you start anything written by Rothbard, you don't have to sort of make yourself finish it. You're immediately pulled in. He was such an extraordinary writer, I think the greatest writer in the history of economics, and maybe history as well, but certainly in terms of economics. And he was so clear, so compelling, so knowledgeable, so point-by-point logical. It's just a thrill. So this little book of his, What Has Government Done to Our Money, is absolutely, as you say, absolutely prescient. All the things that he's talking about in terms of American history and then what he thinks is coming, it's all very applicable to today. And this is true of all his books and other small book that's available for, by the way, that's all these things of Rothbard are available for free at Mises.org, MISES.org. All the Rothbard books, both in ebooks and in PDFs. Just go to Mises.org in the literature section. You can find all these Rothbard books. But another one to look at is his little monograph on the anatomy of the state. It's the kind of book, little book this is, that you read and you're never the same again. I mean, it absolutely, it's like, taking the red pill. I mean, it changes everything, makes you see everything that, that the government is not some kind of public service enterprise that really is looking out for you, cares about you, going to take care of you. Do you understand that the state is an institution with its own interests, which are entirely opposed to your interests? And as Murray said, they're a gang of thieves writ large. I would compare them to the mafia, but I don't want to smear the mafia.
Yeah, and I think the government is a rent-seeking parasite, but I think Wall Street and a lot of large corporations and lobbyists and special interest groups and things like that are rent-seeking parasites too. We just have so many, rent-seeking parasites in our economy right now. But in the book, What Has Government Done to Our Money? I mean, it's a short read. I think it was only 5 hours on audiobook, so it's a very quick read. And like you said, it was extremely well written. It was if I was reading basically the book Currency Wars. It was that well written. Murray was talking, and I guess the book was written in the 60s, about currency wars and every other country, trying to use this Keynesian mercantilist type of economics here, where everyone's trying to gain a trade advantage by devaluing their currency. People want inflation. He was even talking about the IMF and SDRs and how that was, similar to Keynes's theory of the bank core and one world currency and all the different theories for all these government agencies and bureaucrats and central planners who all wanted, one world currency. And it's amazing that we're seeing all this same garbage come out now in white papers from all the Keynesian academics and all the Keynesian central bankers and all the, technocrats and people at the top of the economic and political food chain.
Yeah, and Keynes, of course, wanted a one-world currency, as you say, he called it the bank core, because he didn't want anybody to be able to escape. He didn't want a situation maybe where one country was inflating less than others. So he wanted every country to be, in effect, inflating together, or the World Central Bank, based on the Fed and Bank of England and so forth, inflating together, and there would be no escape. And that everybody would have no choice about their currency depreciating, their savings disappearing. Keynes also, and I must say I never sort of believed it, but in the general theory he also talks about why interest rates can and should be pushed to zero. And it sounded like science fiction to me. I didn't realize that I was going to be living through not quite that, but almost that.
Oh, we're headed there.
Yeah.
We're headed there. That's the only way they can keep this game going longer, Lou. I mean, look at Japan. Japan's been doing this Keynesian nonsense basically longer than anyone else. Even though their private sector was fairly productive for a long time, their government sector has now taken up so much of their budget that it's not sustainable without manipulating the interest rates lower and lower, because they can't ever pay their debt principal back. It's just to be able to pay back to pay the short-term interest rates on the borrowing costs. And the U.S. seems to be headed down that path. Europe seems to be somewhat headed down that path, but they all can't be doing it at the same time without putting inflation throughout the global economy, in my opinion.
I remember back in the Reagan administration when Reagan sent James Baker, who was at that point the Secretary of the Treasury, to Japan to coerce them, of course, is what was actually going on, officially to convince them to get rid of their postal savings system. They had a postal savings system where the interest earned was tax-free. So what the U.S. said was, you're saving too much. The Japanese people are saving too much. They have to be forced to save less, and therefore all interest must be taxed at a high rate in order to bring about more profligacy. And Japan did it, and of course they obeyed the empire. When a guy's living in your backyard and he's got an atomic bomb, if he's asking you something, you're probably going to do it. So and we see this in Europe today, when all the European countries, against their own interest, forced to put these horrible sanctions on Russia, which are hurting the Europeans, of course hurting the Russians, and they're all acts of war under international law. But they do it because the empire orders them to. So, the empire, the U.S. empire, which is in effect the world government, or certainly would like to be the world government, that's its ambition, is making trouble everywhere, and it's usually based on some crazy Keynesian notion when Keynes said in the general theory that people are ruled by the ideas of defunct economists and other intellectuals and little else. Actually, things we're being ruled by the ideas of the defunct Keynes,
and Marx,
and Marx and many other monsters, and it's people who really hated the human race. I mean, these are not friends of mankind, and again, we just have to look at the activities of the U.S. government. How many millions of people has the U.S. government killed in its career of warfare? I mean, it's just a tremendous number. It's not a very nice group of people, and whether it's next time it's Hillary or somebody else, it doesn't so much matter the president, because the president can actually run the biggest, richest, most powerful government in the history of the world by many magnitudes. The U.S. government, there's vast oligarchies and so forth involved, but the thing chugs on. And maybe it's going to be restricted if they succeed in destroying the dollar. We have to see. On the other hand, if there could be a run into the dollar, if say Europe gets in much more serious economic trouble than the U.S. first. So we live in interesting times, Jason.
Yeah, we do. Everyone's trying to use Keynesian economics, like I said, this mercantilist policy. Europe propped up the dollar initially after World War II. Then Japan took over, propping up the dollar after that. Then the developing world, like China and other emerging markets, took over after that. But now, everyone, all those other countries, a lot of them have had so much inflation, like as much inflation as the U.S. has had, based off John Williams of Shadowstats' numbers. Yes. The developing world has had even worse inflation for a very long time. We have listeners to our podcast from all over the world, and they tell us their inflation rates are even higher than in the U.S. So it's just amazing that, every government is trying to devalue their currency. It's a currency war all over the world. Everyone wants inflation because everyone's been running Keynesian policies. Everyone's trying to manipulate their interest rates lower and do Keynesian stimulus and things like that. I'm fed up with it. The Keynesians seem to, want to blame things on capitalism and free markets, but when you manipulate the interest rates, Lou, we don't have capitalism and free markets, right? Because the most important economic signal is the price of money.
Well, we definitely live in a mixed economy, and it's part free economy, part state economy, and of course it's plummeting towards the state side. As Mises said, it's not a stable operation when you have some intervention, and things have to be tending in one direction or the other. More towards freedom, more towards the total state, and of course ours is headed towards the total state. It's a very alarming situation. But this is we've always had this fight in some sense in all of human history between freedom and the state. I guess the state maybe looks back on pharaonic Egypt as a great thing, where the government was actually God. I mean, it wasn't just running everything, but it was actually held to be God or a God. So maybe that's what that's like. But I think if we want to understand what is going on, what is being done to us, there are just some basic principles. For one thing, the government is not above the moral law. What's wrong for you and me, Jason, or other people in our private lives doesn't become morally acceptable, or let alone to be morally glorified, because people are wearing government suits or getting government checks. If counterfeiting is wrong in the private sector, and obviously it is, so is it wrong when the government does it. Or kidnapping, they would call it the draft, or taxation, that's what they call it, but it's theft. Everything, another thing to think about with the government is virtually everything out of their mouths is a lie. If you assume that everything they're saying, economics, foreign policy, civil liberties, Ebola, everything else, if you assume everything they're saying is a lie, you won't be 100% right, but you'll be close to 100% right. They really are liars because, of course, they don't want to tell the truth about what they're doing. They don't want to say, we're ripping you off so we and our friends can live high on the hog. They don't want to say that. So, of course, they're concerned with the common good and the national defense and all the rest of the eyewash that they pour out for us. So you have to stand back from them, try to understand what the government is, what it's doing, and you were nice enough to mention my book earlier. But if you, I think it's an easy book. It's an introduction. It's not a complicated book. It's called Against the State, an Anarcho-Capitalist Manifesto, and it's in the tradition this is a lot of chutzpah on my part to say this. I try to make it in the tradition of Murray Rothbard, who I think was one of the great intellectuals of the West. I mean, he was just an unbelievably extraordinary and creative man that whom I had the great honor of knowing and of working with. But I think this book in just a relatively few pages helps you understand what the government is, why we don't need such a thing, what they're doing to us, why they're ripping you off, and all the ways in which they are ripping you off, and why we don't have to accept it, why there actually is a path out. We're not actually doomed to just go down to a total Mussoliniism or wherever we're headed right now.
Yeah, great points, Lew. And the government is just so hypocritical about so many different things. I mean, we see, the government say one thing and do something completely different. We see the politicians, who are exempt from Obamacare, who are allowed to do insider stock trades on the information they get sitting in committee meetings where they make millions of dollars extra, or they get preferential IPO shares that, go up millions of dollars in only a couple months that people like you and me on the street can't get. And then, if we tried to do anything like that, we'd be thrown in jail immediately. So I think it's just total hypocrisy at so many different levels of government. And then, also the leeches of these corporations now that if the government weren't so large, they wouldn't even be spending any lobbying dollars on that. They'd be investing that money into research and development or building new factories or new products and services and things like that to improve the private sector. My last question for you, Lew, in this interview, and your book I'm sure touches on this, is Ron Paul has talked about, we can't immediately just eliminate government. What are some steps then or solutions for our listeners out there to wake more people up, to implement solutions and to start getting people more awake to what's really going on and start downsizing government, as a slow process to the point where we can start having a discussion about, well, why do we need government for this service and why do we need government for the post office or Amtrak? I mean, we don't even need Amtrak anymore at this point. Why not just spin out a service like Amtrak and, give it to private bidders and let them build bullet trains and things like that? And it's just ridiculous that we have government, in so many different pockets and in so many different things of the economy in our lives.
Well, I think the first thing to do is to in effect change our own minds. I mean, it's for us to understand the government, understand basically what the government is, why it's a ripoff, and to withdraw our consent from it, not to consent to anything that they're doing. So yes, it'd be great to get rid of Amtrak or these things, but I think things have to come from the hearts and the minds of the people. We can't depend on anybody in Washington to do the right thing. So, because the right thing would consist of anything that cut back the government. If 1 cent is taken off the local sales tax, that's good. We'd like to have a lot more than that. But anything like that these days, maybe just holding them back is sufficient for the time being, because government is growing at such an unbelievable speed. But I think that again, you first have to see things clearly. It involves learning some economics, maybe some real history, understanding a little bit of political philosophy, and we're not talking hard stuff. I mean, this is all stuff that makes absolute sense to the average person who applies his or her mind to it. So I think that's what we have to do. And I think if we first concentrate on, say, trying to get Congress to shut down Amtrak, which would be a great thing, it's a terrible thing, Amtrak. You get ensnared in the coils of government. That's what they'd love us all to do. So I think we have to stand back. We have to withdraw our consent. There's a great essay by a man called Boetie, Boetie, who was a 16th century lawyer, and Murray Rothbard. By the way, his essay on the politics of obedience is up on Mises.org. It's also on LewRockwell.com, and Murray Rothbard's unbelievable introduction to this early anarchist thinker. But he said, all the political thinkers of my time always want to know, how do we make sure everybody obeys the king? He said, I want to know, why does anybody obey the king? It's clearly not in anybody's interest except the king's interest. Why do people do it? So he explores why it is so important to the government to have the people's consent, and why withdrawing consent can actually bring down a government. It's a brilliant essay, very, very beautifully written, beautifully translated into English. It speaks very clearly to our situation today. And I would also say read anything Rothbard. There are obviously many other great men. You mentioned earlier Henry Hazlitt's Economics 1 Lesson still maybe the best-selling economics book ever. I mean, it's a tremendous piece of work. Hazlitt was, also wrote the definitive refutation of Keynesianism, and
Yeah, I read that too. That was good.
so much else. And he was a great man too. I mean, just a great, like Mises, like Rothbard. These are just great human beings. I mean, just really admirable people, and sort of the opposite of, say, Keynes or Marx. So that's very important. Mises is important to read, but I would say start with Rothbard. He's so compelling. He explains things so clearly, whether it's in economics or history or political philosophy, or in his case, sports, or he wrote about a lot of different things. Everything's for free on the internet, either at Mises.org or LewRockwell.com. And read Rothbard. I mean, that if you want to educate yourself, if you want to understand what is being done to you and your family, what you can do about it, first step is read Rothbard. You read my book too, by the way, but reading Rothbard is much more important.
Is your book available on audiobook too?
It is about to be available in audiobook, not quite yet, but it will be. So
Okay,
far
very
it's just
good.
ebook and the physical book.
Yeah, if I could add another book recommendation in there, it's a short read. It's Bastiat's A Law, too.
Oh,
a lot
great
of
book.
Yes. Yes.
Anything but Bastiat was such a clear writer, another great writer, and by the power of his pen and his mind, still affects things today. I mean, he's just anything of Bastiat is worth reading. But yeah, start with The Law. Great book. Little book.
Well, yeah, it's a very short read. I think it's only like about 2 hours. But I just want to thank you again for your time, Lew. Hopefully we'll have you back on again soon. I really enjoyed the discussion, and we could talk. I could talk for hours about all the stupid things that the Keynesians and the interventionist central planners are doing. I just think it's hilarious. They make a lot of the same mistakes, and then most of the people, unfortunately, are not woken up like you and me, and they can just blame capitalism and the free markets for a lot of the problems when they made the problems. And that's why book smart, common sense, stupid people like Paul Krugman still have high-paying jobs and get high-paid consulting gigs and stuff.
Like the CDC blaming the heroic nurse in Texas for the fact that because of their bad protocol, she got Ebola. I mean, so they always want to blame the victim. Certainly, in their view, the government never does anything wrong and always its reputation has to be protected by lies and secrecy and so forth. So don't believe anything they say. Look for the real truth, which is typically the opposite of what they're saying, and be informed and be free.
Well, great words, Lew. And I want our listeners to please check out your website, LewRockwell.com. It's one of the best sources out there for truth and information about liberty, libertarianism, and Austrian School Economics.
Thank you, Jason.